They say small towns run on coffee, gossip, and miracles nobody believes until they're standing ankle deep in them. And I didn't believe in any of it until the night the sirens failed, and the sky over Cedar Basin turned the color of an old bruise. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story grabs you by the collar the way it grabbed me, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next ride. Because what happened between a missing boy, a storm that broke the valley's back, and a scarred gelding named Harlan changed how this town talks about fate. It started with the wind, a hard, mean wind that came through the cottonwoods like it owed them money, flipping the willow leaves white and setting the horses to fussing against their stall doors. I was in the feed room counting bags we couldn't afford to replace when the first crack split the ridge and the lights blinked out, the kind of blink that isn't a threat but a decision, and the only sound left was rain marching across the tin roof like boots. Sheriff radio, dead. Phone line, dead. Generator, dead until the sixth pull when it coughed to life and lit the aisle a sickly yellow. I stepped into it and almost tripped over the one horse I should have expected to find out of place. Harlan, the tall, ugly, handsome roan with old rope scars on his pasterns and a scar like a white river down his shoulder, was standing square in the alley with his head up and his ears locked to the north, as if he'd heard a word spoken from 30 miles away, and was already halfway to answering it. He was not my best broke, not my prettiest, not the animal I would have picked for anything involving common sense. But when he stood like that, frozen, focused, as if listening through walls, he reminded me of a veteran reading a room before anyone else knew there was a room to read. "You're not going out in that," I told him, which was a foolish thing to tell a horse who had made a career of disobeying bad ideas. Lightning stitched the sky and the storm spoke again. And underneath the thunder I thought I heard something thin and human that didn't belong to the weather at all. It was the boy. Eli Mercer, 8 years old, last seen by his mother when the power died and the wind took the back screen door off like a thief. 1 second he was picking up toy soldiers. The next he was a memory. They lived 2 miles north along the floodplain, where the creek turns mean when it's angry. I saddled by flashlight fast the way you are when your hands remember even if your head is still arguing. And Harlan took the bit like he had been waiting for an assignment and finally got it. Rain was needles. Mud was soup. The road out of the yard vanished into the storm and then came back again as if it liked the game. Half the valley was dark except for the sheet lightning that made every fence post a strobe and every tree a monster. "You don't owe me this," I said into the wind. But Harlan dropped a shoulder and went anyway, choosing a line that ignored the road and cut straight for the cottonwoods. The way barn cats cut straight for the one person who doesn't want them. By the time we reached the creek, it wasn't a creek anymore. It was brown muscle, shouldering over the banks and carrying someone else's garden fence in its teeth. I would have turned any other horse. Harlan stepped into the hawk, felt the bottom with the kind of careful I trusted, and crabbed his way across, using his chest like a wedge. On the far bank above the roar, I heard it again, that thin sound start-stop like a bad radio, and Harlan heard it too because he snapped his head to the left and locked onto something I couldn't see. There's a particular feeling when the world shrinks to a beam of rain, and a point where a life might be, your heart doesn't beat faster. It gets heavier, as if it's trying to anchor the rest of you to the moment. We climbed the muddy berm behind the Mercer's place and saw the shape the wind had made out of what used to be a yard. Patio furniture in the pear tree. The coop upside down in the ditch. Tire ruts that hadn't been there at supper. The back door was splintered where the hinge had given up, and the kitchen window banged without rhythm. I shouted and got the storm's answer. Harlan didn't waste breath. He pulled me along the fence line and then stopped so hard I grabbed leather. In the flashlight cone I saw it. A small sneaker jammed under a slat, the kind of sneaker boys pick because they light up when they run. This one didn't light up. I got off, crawled under the fence, and found the trail where small hands had clawed through wet weeds toward the one outbuilding that hadn't surrendered. An old corn crib built when people expected weather to be a conversation, not a war. Its door had been slammed by the storm and then jammed by a plank. Inside, a voice. Help! Not loud, not brave, just there like the last knot on a rope. I pulled, The plank didn't want to move, and Harlan, who had no thumbs and no patience, stepped in, put his chest to the wood, and pressed until the board squealed and slipped. The door swung an inch, then two, and I got my fingers in it and made a promise to muscles I hadn't used since high school. The door came and I fell backward into the rain with Eli landing against my knees like a sack of wet birds. He was breathing, which is to say I was. The smart move was back to the house, but the creek had more ideas, and none of them included a second crossing with a child who shook like a dog after fireworks. I wrapped Eli in my oilskin and tied him to me with the lead rope around both our waists, the kind of knot you use when you plan not to let go, even if it means learning to swim in your boots. "We're going to walk out behind him," I said into his hair, which smelled like shampoo and mud. "And we're going to trust the big, ugly horse to keep his feet." Harlan had already turned toward the ridge that climbs behind the Mercer's alfalfa, the long way home, but higher ground and less water with an appetite. He moved slow as prayer, feeling with his toes on shale and roots, taking the kind of short, deliberate steps that earn trust one footfall at a time. Lightning found us more than once, and every time it did I saw the White River scar and thought of rope and dogs and someone else's bad years, and I wondered how many times in his first life Harlan had gone forward into something he didn't choose. At the oak stand where the ridge flattens, the storm changed its mind. The rain went sideways, the wind found another gear, and in the bright slice of a strike I saw what the valley would look like in tomorrow's paper. Fences laid down, one roof off, 2 trucks nose deep in what had been a dry arroyo at lunch. Eli made a sound that wasn't words and pressed closer. "You picked a fine night to take a walk," I said. And he said, "Mom said not to open the door," and then he started crying so quietly I would have missed it if the storm had any mercy. It didn't, so I heard it, and somehow that felt like the first good omen of the night. On the spine of the ridge, where lightning had burned a cottonwood years back and left it standing like a sermon, Harlan stopped. Ears pricked, head turned toward the south meadow. I didn't hear anything except wind and the long, low grind the bolt-on barn doors make when they hate their job, but I had learned by then to ask him what he knew. We dropped down the far side, sliding mud and shale in a kind of controlled failure, and caught the angle of the meadow fence near my south gate. Behind it, something flashed white and moved wrong. The big bull from the Miller place, cut loose by the storm, and hung up in wire. Good way to go from rescue to obituary. Not tonight, I told everything listening. And we detoured because it's a sin to walk past a thing you can fix. I put Eli behind the low stone wall where the meadow ends and told him to sing anything he knew, as loud as he could so I could find him in the dark. He started a halting version of the alphabet that turned into something that might have been a camp song, and might have been nonsense. Harlan faced the bull squared up and still, radiating the kind of other horse confidence only certain animals carry, and I went to wire with my cutters. 2 snips, 3, a yank, a curse, the kind of patient swearing that keeps your fingers attached. The bull blew, rocked, and then stood free and insulted, and I counted that as a yes. We didn't wait for applause. We climbed back to the ridge with Eli's song. Stretching like a thread, we reeled ourselves up on. By the time we hit the ranch lane, the rain had thinned into the exhausted kind that falls after a storm has said its piece. The generator's light looked like a promise I had forgotten how to believe in and was remembering on the fly. I put Eli by the stove and laid dry blankets over him, and made cocoa so strong it bordered on wrong. He took it in both hands and looked at me over the rim with the face of a kid who has used up more courage than he had. Harlan stood in the doorway with his whole body saying he'd like to watch the perimeter. Thanks. And I obeyed him because he'd been right all night. Eli's mother arrived like a flood of another sort. Soaked, hoarse, more apology than person. And when she realized her boy was there and warm and breathing, she made a sound that rearranged the furniture of the human heart. The sheriff came after, full of reasons the radio hadn't worked and promises to fix things that storms teach you not to trust. All of that is town business. What matters is Harlan stood where the light fell across the yard and watched the road until his ears softened and his eye glassed over with the kind of tired that isn't sleep. It's the absence of anything left to worry about. If the story ended there, it would be enough. boy found, horse heroic, rancher with a good cup of cocoa and a better generator. But it didn't end, because the valley has a way of adding footnotes you can't ignore. In the blue morning after, when everything steams and crows pretend they own it all, Mrs. Mercer came back with a bag of biscuits and the long, embarrassed look of someone who has to ask a heavy favor. Eli had been quiet before the storm, she said. The kind of quiet that hugs the edges of rooms. School had suspended him twice for walking out when the noise got tall, and sleep didn't like him enough to stay. She asked if he could come by after school sometimes, help with feed and talk to the horses. Or not talk, if that was better. I said yes before the question finished. You don't say no to a chance to turn a night into a path. Eli started coming Tuesdays and Thursdays. Then most days, then every day the sun remembered us. He didn't talk much at first. He stood by Harlan's shoulder and breathed in the same rhythm. He learned how to coil a rope without letting it think it had won, how to read ears and nostrils like road signs, how to swing a gate without the latch barking his knuckles. Harlan, who would crowd any adult careless enough to forget boundaries, gave Eli space, then the right kind of closeness, then a kind of shared center I don't know how to name except to say those two understood each other, without the rest of us in the way. Spring drifted toward summer, and the creek forgot its temper for a while. The Mercers brought lemonade on Saturdays, and the sheriff stopped by to apologize so poorly. It counted as charming. Harlan changed in the small ways that add up. Less grind on the bit, more thought before the spook, a habit of checking the yard at dusk like a sentinel who likes his post. We started using him to pony the green colts because panic ran off him like rain off a tin roof. And when a trailer door banged, he didn't sit down on a memory. He looked to the left, as if listening for a boy's breath, and squared himself. One late June afternoon, when the heat had cooked the smell of clover into syrup and the flies were insufferable, a dust devil carried a feed sack across the lot, and one of the 3-year-olds decided she was born to the wild. She reared, kissed the top rail with a hind shoe, and tumbled. A tangle of legs, wire, and bad odds. I was already moving when Eli moved faster. He slid under the rail and wrapped both arms around her head the way I'd taught him not to, unless the world was on fire. It was, in a way. "Hold her," I said, and he said, "I am." And his voice was that new kind of steady children get when they remember something no one else taught them. Themselves. Harlan stepped in, braced, and the filly felt the calm come through the ground and stopped fighting. We cut her free with only a nick and a lesson. Eli sat back on his heels, shaking and grinning, and Harlan breathed in his hair like somebody stamping a passport. People ask sometimes why I tell this story like the horse did the saving. They say, "Didn't you ride? Didn't you cut wire and make cocoa and find the path?" Sure. But here is the thing I learned the night the valley lost its electricity and found its backbone. Some animals are bridges. You don't walk on them. You walk with them. And they carry every heavy thing you set down without complaint because that's what they were built for, even if it wasn't what they were used for. Harlan had belonged to men who gave him scars and jobs measured only in pull and sweat. The storm gave him a different job and introduced him to a boy who needed a quiet taller than thunder. If you're still with me, and if you are, tell me in the comments where you're watching from so I know what rivers and ridges these words have crossed. Tap like and subscribe, because there's a part 2 to every night like that. The morning when you decide whether it was a one-off or the start of a better habit. Around here we chose habit. We keep a kit by the door. We changed the latch on the Mercer's back screen. We put a bell on the creek gate that you can hear, even when the wind has your hat. Eli still comes most afternoons. He doesn't always need words while he picks out Harlan's feet or walks him to water. But sometimes he talks more now. About the spelling test he aced, about being brave without an audience, about sleeping through a thunderstorm and dreaming of nothing at all because nothing, for a kid who used to dream of falling, is the best dream you can have. And when lightning rolls over the ridge and the phones get shy, Harlan stands by the stall door and listens to the north, ears pricked like he's waiting for that thin voice to call again. Not because he wants another storm, but because he loves a job done right and a road found in the dark.